wasn't in my resume, but you know, I have to say, what Joanne didn't say is that I served twice. Twice I served. And it's so nice to be home. So nice to see so many friends and to be back in the Purce, you know, next to the deserts of southern Idaho. There's no place like the Purce. I always ask people when I'm over on the west side and around May, has everything begun to turn green yet over there? Because this is my the time I love the most. But make sure I get this. Really talk lemon now. When I think about this community, I look out here at all of you and these young people that have received these awards, and the energy and intentionality that it takes for a community to be engaged like you all have been, the task force for all of these years. And I know about it because I've lived some of it. I've been up here before. If you look at the plaque, look at the pictures over there, you'll see 1997, 17 years ago that I had been here before. But, you know, what I want to say as I just begin to talk with you a bit about this is that this community has always been rare and special. There's been this extraordinary tie between all of the important institutions of this community that makes Moscow, the university, this area, a very, very, very special place. It's because you've done something that is very important. You've taken the steps to integrate all of your institutions into the efforts that you've directed, any of the efforts that you think about in this community. If it's human rights, you have the university, you have the government, and then you have community groups that have been engaged. This is not a normal thing. Many communities struggle. Now, I know, having been involved in politics in this state and having run the Department of Health and Welfare at one point, that we all have our challenges, and I remember some of the challenges in this community. But, you know, the first thing that I remember 30 years ago when I went on the board of Ballet Folk was that the extraordinary kind of commitment that all of the community made to the effort that came from the groups that started that initiative. So many things start in Boise. And I remember in those early years how much, when this was a very successful endeavor, how badly those people in Boise wanted to still it and bring it down to Boise where everything is. Now, being from Pocatello, I understand that too. But what you all did in this community is that you came together. I know I was on the board. The university, the citizens of the community that were committed to it, and you used all of your resources together in partnership to make that success. That's just one example. This task force is another example. It is just absolutely extraordinary to look out here and to see the young people that have come, have done their essays and their artwork, and all of you that are here today to reaffirm the importance of human rights, of equity, because it does not happen by accident, everyone, and it can go away very quickly. We're at a time in our country where there is a huge tension about the direction that we'll go, huge tension around what we're going to commit to in terms of the lives of people. The other night in my talk, I talked about the concern that I had about 3 areas as it related to Dr. King's dream. I spoke about how he talked about the promissory note that had not been paid, and what that meant, and how he could not believe this United States could not open its vaults of humanity to be able to pay that promissory note. What an extraordinary, extraordinary image. I talked about poverty. 48 million people in this country now in poverty. I talked about Lyndon Johnson when he gave his speech in the War on Poverty. It was a war on poverty, but in that speech, he talked about housing, employment, education, the whole new society deal that he put in that particular package. And now the arguments are, was it a failure or not? Well, there are a lot of people in this country that whose families have changed drastically because of that commitment. There are many, many people in this country that would not be where they are and had their next generation go on to college if they had not had the support of the programs that helped in housing, helped in unemployment, that fed kids. Now, like everything, things evolve, policies evolve, and governmental help evolves. But our sense of humanity does not change. Our commitment to the human things do not change. The question is, what is the best way in which we can recommit to our fellow citizens that don't have the advantages that we have? And now we're faced with this extraordinary schism where the middle class is going the other direction because of this economy as well. And what do we do? And how do we commit to this whole issue of poverty? Because all of it is linked. All of it is linked. This issue of poverty and the way it pervades communities. And in my talk, I talked about the description of people in shanties and ghettoized public housing, in trailer parks, removed, isolated, alone from other people, ashamed, and just managing from day to day to be able to make ends meet. About the kids that don't have food to eat, and about young men and women that have had a life of poverty that looks like it will never change again. And as I thought about that, and I talked about that, I thought, what do we do? How do we get our arms around it? How do we articulate what human rights and the task force is about, and people that are committed to making these kinds of changes, and making sure that our democracy realizes what we say our Constitution aspires to? How do we begin to do that? Well, the first thing we do is we organize like you all have. And secondly, we make sure that the young people become engaged. Because there's a lot of us that have gray hair now, and if we don't have young people that are engaged in the efforts to bring their ideas, their point of view, their perspective, their skills and special gifts, and trust me, I know they have many. I see them every year going through my college. I meet them every year when they come in as freshmen. I participate in the class every year, just so I can stay in touch with the way these young people come and the gifts they have and what their needs are and what their concerns are. I am deeply concerned about the fact that it seems that at least at the public level, and this is something that will be formidable for all of you in this task force, at the public level within our legislatures, at least in the state of Washington, and I think generally around this country, I've spoken to this, more and more the rhetoric talks about a public education being a personal good, not a public good. And as the economy has gone, the investment in education has declined, which makes it a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because if we aren't adding money and the families are now paying the tuition, then obviously it's a personal good. You know, how difficult, how quickly we forget about the assumptions of the foundation of our public institutions, our public higher institutions, and our K-12 system. President Lincoln had the foresight with the Morrill Act to establish the land grants of which this fine institution, this flagship is, right? And Pocatello used to go, flagship! But you are, that's right. But it wasn't just the land grant movement that he initiated in that movement. It was also the normal schools, that started all of the teachers, of which my grandmother came from the first normal schools, the historically black schools, Lincoln University. It was the systems that were put in place by our leaders then that said our communities need to have people that are educated, and they need to be the people in those communities. And we have to have a system that supports that kind of effort. And that was the beginning of the public initiatives that transformed our country. Transformed our country. And now, at a time when we have to make critical decisions about our economic status and our future in this country, and we have this growing number of people moving into poverty, we have public policies that are directed, that are talking about the personal good, and we have policies that are removing the public support for people to have access. As I have said to my board of trustees, and I say to my faculty at Evergreen, my greatest fear is that the future may not allow individuals that are poor or other people of color to fully access higher education, to fully take advantage of a K-12 system that is kind and humane to them as they attempt to access education and do what all of us have an opportunity to do, to move up in our lives with our families because of the opportunities that we had in regard to education. If that happens, we can forget this democracy, everyone, because the key to this democracy is having a citizenry that understands, that can think for itself, that can voice its concerns, that can be a huge part of the direction that we want to make a commitment to about who we are as a country. You know, when Dr. King talked about when Dr. King talked about the content of our character rather than our skin, it's also not just our skin, it's our sexual preference, it's gender, it's people that are poor. All of those people, we talk about the issue of equal opportunity. We still know from so many studies that issues of equal opportunity are still very important. You look at the studies where there are resumes that are written that are exactly the same, and you submit them to a corporation, identical ones, and one of them has Shakita on it and another has Susan. They choose Susan because it's a name they're familiar with. In our country, the challenge that we have of the inclination that we have to pick and to associate with people that are like us is something that we have to continue to work at when we talk about equal opportunity. You know, this as I was talking the other night with all of the students after my talk, I tell you, it was just wonderful. I mean, I wish, if you weren't there, the students came up to ask questions after the talk. One young woman came up and said, you know, my dad is a hard worker, my mother was a hard worker. During the middle of the recession, my dad lost his job, and my mother had a part-time job, and they could hardly make it. And we tried to get just enough help to be able to make it as a family. We didn't qualify for food stamps, which is all we would have needed to be able to make it. Dr. Purce, why is it that when there are people that are hard workers, that they disqualify for food stamps when they still aren't making it, but people that are really super poor qualify for it? And I told her, first of all, you do not want to pit your situation against a person that's super poor. You're both poor. Don't do that. Because politically, there are people that are inclined to switch things around on you and make the issue the poor people, make the issue your problems, and not take responsibility for what we have as a country, as a state, as a governmental entity, to make sure that all of our citizens have something to eat, that all of our citizens are warm and have a place over their head. Now, you know, in our democracy, that can happen through the initiative of government, One of my initiatives when I was mayor and in government had to do with fair housing. My father and mother were active in the low-income housing movement. The Idaho Housing Agency was established through the efforts of my father and a group of people that started out in the Amherst administration to do that. My mother was one of the founding members of the Human Rights Commission in this state and served for 13 years in that capacity. I watched them establish and work at these issues that took a long time to establish. And the modifications in terms of how people treat the policies and the people that are in charge have a huge effect on how effective they are. We have to pay attention. We have to keep engaged in these areas. You know, I was thinking about my grandmother. And last night I told a story about my grandmother and the fact that they came to this state just after the turn of the last century. And she couldn't teach when she came because of segregation. She was a domestic. And when my grandfather was killed in a rodeo in 1930 in Billings, she had, in the middle of the Depression, 5 kids to feed, take care of. And she talked about how, ironically, was one of the first employees of the city of Pocatello and sat in the audience at age 96 when I became mayor. And it was an extraordinary thing for her. She had an extraordinary life. But she said to me, you know, Tommy, education is a double-edged sword. And her story really was a thing that I think that directed me to the love of my life, education. She says, you know, your Uncle Wesley, he was my uncle that was 2 years older than my mother, Idaho, who was the youngest of these 9 kids. You know, he was brilliant in math. He could figure anything out. After he'd go to school, he'd come home and I'd tutor him, and she said he knew numbers, and she said, you know, when he graduated from high school, the only job he could get was a job as a ditch digger, and he was working for this ditch digger and a lot of other laborers, and at the end of the week they got their pay, and he looked at his pay, and he got his pencil out and he figured what they said they were going to pay and how many hours he worked and how much money he got. And he went to the boss man and he said, I think you owe me some more money. We worked these hours, you said you'd pay us this much, you've only given me this much. And the guy, oh. And the guy gave him the rest of his money. Well, all of the other people there were illiterate, and so they came to my 18-year-old Uncle Wesley and said, will you figure mine out? So Wesley sat on a rock and figured everybody's out, of course. And of course, everybody was underpaid. And you know what happened to Wesley. Now, how's that a message about education, about the skills that you have and your gifts? She said that to me. So, that powerful message about how important education is came to us so many ways when I was a kid in Pocatello. There were the old black people that had come from the South that would talk with you about what it was like in Jim Crow and the stories they would tell. Hard stories, everyone. Some of them hard stories about education. And I remember an old guy, you know, it's not a pleasant story, but it was reinforcing to me about the value of education and about ignorance. Bob Dylan wrote about it in one of his songs. It was called Black Stone. And it was called The Story of Hezekiah Jones from Arkansas, a true story. He said, there's a man once by the name of Hezekiah Jones. Didn't have much, a farm and some land. He ate when he grew a few pigs and stuff. And Hezekiah could save his money, and Hezekiah would buy books with that money. And Hezekiah would put those books in his cabinet, and he said he'd keep them for the rainy season. One day, Reverend Greening of the white man's church came by, knocking on doors. He knocked on Hezekiah's door. He said, Hezekiah, do you believe in the Lord? Hezekiah said, well, I ain't never seen the Lord. You can't believe in nothing you ain't seen. And the guy says, Hezekiah, do you believe in the church? Hezekiah said, well, the churches are divided. They can't make up their mind. I can't make up mine neither. And the man said, Hezekiah, do you believe that being good is heaven your last reward? Hezekiah said, I'm good. I'm good. As good as my neighbor. And the man said, Hezekiah, you know that there's a lot of good ways to be wicked. And they hung Hezekiah high up as a pigeon. White folks around said, well, the son of a bitch had it coming. He didn't have no religion. That story about ignorance, about the fear that people have about the power of education, was a powerful story for us young people back in Pocatello in those days, from just one of the people that came from the South. A reminder about the issues around a system at that time with Jim Crow that was so powerful. You know, I thought about that, young kids, because I didn't want it to be a downer. But it's important for us to understand where we come from, what's at stake, and how easy it is, and we in Idaho know it better than anyone else, about hate, and about how easy it is when people are afraid, are ignorant, uneducated, about the effects it can have on community. And it can turn like that. That's why this task force is so important. So important. I think about the privilege of being able to be here and to talk with you about these kinds of concerns, because in my talk I said the kids are so important, and to have them engaged in what you do in all its levels are essential for all of our efforts. I have my guitar here because at Evergreen, often I taught a class one time called Music is Politics with some friends, and it spoke to a lot of the issues of human rights and social justice and young people. My grandmother ended up having 4 sons: Uncle Wesley, Uncle Lester, Uncle Spuds, and Uncle Alfred. Now, my grandmother tutored all of her kids. My Uncle Alfred was the first African American to be hired as a bus driver in San Francisco. And I remember talking to his wife after he died, and she said, well, you know, your Uncle Alfred, you know, he was an educated man, and he was, and when he had to take the test, he took the test and passed it, so he was the first one that was hired. But what I really had to think about was what it was like for these 4 African American men in southern Idaho, being raised in the 30s, being educated individuals that really had no pathway for the growth, their personal growth and opportunities of employment and equal opportunities to be able to pursue the life that they could, given the gifts that they had and what they had done in terms of what they had learned. All 4 of my uncles died of alcoholism. I think about, for people of color, for poor people, the extraordinary pressures, the stress that comes from being poor, the stress that comes from being discriminated against, and how somehow within this system we have to recognize and compensate for this very powerful force You see it in many ways and in many studies. You look at studies that have to do with healthy childbirth, and you see that African American women, both of financial means and not, have similar kinds of childbirth, which is low. You see a distinction between white women that have resources. Their childbirth outcomes are much higher than poor white women. And then, if you bring African women here, the first generation are similar to white women, but the second generation is similar to African American women. It speaks to this stress that is this force that is in play with racism and a sense of immobility that exists that somehow in this country we have to figure out how to overcome. But when I think about my uncles, and I think about their lives, and I think about poverty, I think about a song that Tom Russell, who's a marvelous writer, wrote, and I want to share it with you as I conclude my comments.